We turn now to my DFR Lab colleague, Jared Holt, for a conversation about how conspiracy theories can escalate to acts of violent extremism. We'll then come right back here to the studio for a conversation with some of the foremost experts on extremism about how we can stop, or at least get ahead of, increasing extremism online. See you shortly.
Joining me in conversation is Hussein Kesvani. He's a journalist and master's student at UCL studying religious conversion in digital spaces, and Becca Lewis, a PhD candidate at Stanford University researching far-right movements and their digital efforts. Hussein, Becca, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk about online radicalization, especially in the wake of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. This has been getting a lot more attention, but it's been a focus in the broader digital space for some time because this phenomenon of online radicalization not infrequently is producing real life results, and sometimes those results can be rather violent. So, Hussein, I'll start with you. First, I want to just kind of lay out exactly what we're talking about for individuals who may be sort of newer to thinking about this, or haven't really spent a lot of time on the topic before. What is radicalization? What do we mean? What do we not mean when we're talking about radicalization online?
It's a really good question, because I don't actually think there is a coherent answer as to what radicalization is. And the reason, so I live in Britain, and in this country we've had a program for a long time called the Prevent Strategy, which has sort of been the UK's flagship, very heavily invested counter-radicalization strategy, which was really amped up in the wake of the 7/7 bombings, the London bombings, on public transport. And a lot of it was focused on Islamist, or this notion of Islamist radicalization, which included the process of online radicalization. That program kind of went from this idea that radicalization was this kind of holistic societal process in which young people, often young men, but young women as well, but mostly the program focused mostly on young men who were alienated from their local communities, and therefore were looking for alternatives on in spaces like forums and on early social media platforms. In 2010, when that program got consolidated and put into the Home Office, the community element of it really dissipated, and it became this very centralized program in which the notion of online radicalization became in their terms ideological. It was about subscribing to particular ideological aspects of what they considered to be conservative Islam, certain tenets and practices. So for example, they would say that if a Muslim, for example, has a negative view about gay marriage or LGBT issues, and that could be an element that could lead to radicalization. If a young Muslim is very interested in particular speakers, or they're going to conservative websites, that could begin the process of radicalization as well. So for them, radicalization was, the term that was kind of bandied around government was conveyor belt theory. It was this idea that you can start from this small place, and as you kind of meet more people, eventually you get to this point where you'll find someone who will convince you to then take up arms, or to travel to Syria in some cases to go fight. That was their definition of radicalization. And the reason why I think that this is a really difficult question to answer is because the goalposts have changed so long, and it's really difficult to keep in touch. And moreover, it's very difficult for it's been very difficult to actually get answers from the British government as to what radicalization is. I spent a good year and a half of my career trying to find out the answer to this question and never really getting a response. So in that sense, I think that's how I consider online radicalization to be framed, although obviously I think, with January 6th, but also with QAnon, generation identity, and so on, the notion of online radicalization has kind of really changed how people define it. I think there are multiple definitions of it.
Becca, would you tend to agree with Hussein there? A lot of your work that's been published has been a bit more US centered. Do you think, those observations carry over into a domestic space?
I think there are a lot of really similar challenges in terms of defining radicalization in the US and looking specifically at white supremacy and radicalization into white supremacy. It is really tough to define, but the way that I think I've tended to look at it is a gradual rejection of what we might think of as mainstream or kind of more official institutional worldviews and ideas in favor of more extremist ones. And whether those extremist ones are white supremacist, whether they are neo-Nazi ideas, it can really vary, but in some form it involves kind of the gradual rejection of certain ideas and the gradual adoption of certain other ideas. The problem that you get into is that I think a lot of times we like to think about this radicalization process as one where someone kind of ventures into the deep dark corners of the internet and gets involved in 4chan or 8chan or any number of forums that have come to take their place, and that is the case often. So if you think of the Christchurch shooter, that's a case of someone who started to adopt far right radical ideas, kind of had them take over his life, went kind of down that rabbit hole, and then committed these acts of violence. But that doesn't quite define what we experienced, for example, on January 6th, where actually there's a lot of overlap with what at this point is the mainstream Republican and right-wing talking points. And you have people who have supported the storming of the Capitol, who also are in office and who are kind of these official sources. You have people on Fox News kind of questioning all of the official stories about it. And so in those cases, we can't really think about it as venturing into these deep, dark corners of the internet. You actually, I think, have to think of it more in terms of an entire political group in the United States becoming radicalized.
So it sounds to me like, it's less of a specific pattern, or it's more of like a pattern of behavior, right? It's less of like a specific, I clicked the YouTube video, I clicked the bad one, and now I believe terrible things. So, I guess the next possible question is, and Hussein, I'll take this to you, is like, what makes people vulnerable to this? I think for those of us, like many of the people at this conference today, that aren't down the rabbit hole, so to say, it's easy to look at people who have either gradually or very quickly adopted these kind of beliefs and wonder kind of what happened or what went wrong. And, there's not like a perfectly clean and succinct answer here, but Hussein, since you are the panelist, I will let you take a crack at it instead of myself.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because, again, like, it varies from people to people. So when I was writing my book, which was looking at young British Muslims from 2015 to 2017, and it really started with this, the reason why I wrote this book was because a person that I knew had gone over to Syria to go fight with ISIS, or like a person I knew online had gone to go fight with ISIS. And it didn't make sense because he had, seemingly been part of mainstream society. And not only that, but he had kind of like fulfilled the myths of meritocracy. This was a kid who grew up in a working class like family, like grew up on, in a housing project, and now like worked in quite a senior job at like an investment bank, like lived a really lavish lifestyle that, a lot of people would be envious of. And then he decided to just like quit and, go to Turkey and then go over to Syria from there. It was completely unexpected. And then like the more I started thinking about it and the more I was interviewing young like men and who had like similarities, I kind of saw some patterns. So like, the obvious ones are obviously like alienation and feeling as if like you're not really kind of part of mainstream society, like you don't really have a stake in it. So for like young Muslims, it was very much like, how can I balance my kind of religious identity with like this secular one, especially when my religious identity is one that is constantly being tarnished by like mainstream media outlets and, being vilified. And then by extension, like looking at these international like conflicts and, what is a Muslim's responsibility there. So in that way, like my initial take was, oh, this is kind of about conflicts of identity and how they like play out they can play out in these kind of extreme ways where you reject one form of how you view extremism for another. I think the more I think about it, though, I think like isolation is obviously like a part of it, but I also think that the broader aspect is kind of how many people feel that they have material stake in society, like how many people kind of feel like they like want to really buy into mainstream institutions and the way that they work. I think so many, like even when you look at like right-wing radicalization narratives, a lot of it is kind of rooted in this disenfranchisement of global capitalism and the corporate economy. Like lots of them like are really disenfranchised with the ubiquity of the gig economy and all these things that you would associate right-wing politics to be in relation to finance is sort of like dissembled. So what do you do with this group of like people who used to identify being right in a particular way? And and it makes sense that so many of the people who kind of veered towards QAnon and these other radical movements were initially like very enthusiastic Donald Trump supporters, many of whom just felt very disillusioned with the promises Trump made that he never fulfilled. And I think like a lot of it is really that. I think a lot of it is just this broader feeling of like disillusionment with society and the institutions that have run it, this acknowledgement of failure for the most part, and the idea that like none of these institutions or politicians or like people of authority have posited any answers or solutions.
And that sort of tension between an individual and the society that they feel may not represent them or may not be interested in them, two-way street sort of thing. That's a dynamic that a lot of the content creators, extremist and sort of extremist adjacent, factor in to the messages that they're putting out to these audiences. You can see that very prominently on a station like Fox News now, as you were saying, Becca. In the US at least, these kind of messages are becoming, the dominant sort of commentary coming from the Republican side of the aisle, unfortunately. Becca, you've done a lot of research about the way that some of these creators, network with each other online, some of the, presentation and framing that they use. Can you talk more about, what you've found out or what you've been able to deduce about the different sort of factors and strategies that the people making this content and driving this sort of radicalization engine are using? And I'm also curious to the degree that you personally believe it may be malicious or almost like subconscious, as content creators are both influencing their audience and being influenced by the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that I agree completely with Hussein that, I think a lot of times it begins with this sense of disenfranchisement or alienation from mainstream institutions. And what happens is when people, I think, very reasonably start to feel that alienation, that there are these other groups, individuals, networks of people that kind of swoop in and are able to provide an alternative explanation for the way that the world works. And often the way that this works and the way that I've in particular researched is through these online influencers or online celebrities, creators, whatever you want to call them, people who are broadcasting to an audience on YouTube or on any number of other platforms, whether that's Twitch, TikTok, Twitter, really all of the mainstream social media platforms. You see people who the platforms have created these economies where people are incentivized to make content and broadcast it to an audience and kind of build up an audience. And whether that's millions of viewers or a few thousand viewers, as long as you have a devoted audience, you can have some level of power and influence on these platforms. And what happens for young people or people in general watching these creators is that they can build a real sense of trust and intimacy. People who might feel like they're lacking guidance or mentorship or socializing or any number of things can feel like that's provided through a celebrity or an influencer online. And fandom of celebrities has been like a huge phenomenon for over a century at this point. It's a long-standing phenomenon, and it's also a long-standing phenomenon that people come to feel that part of their identity is defined by who they follow and who they are a fan of. And on social media, you get that kind of ramped up, further than it's ever been before, particularly because you have these people that seem like they're people that are just like you and me. They broadcast from their bedrooms. They tell deeply personal stories. A lot of times, the type of content that radicalizes people can't even really be fact checked, because people are just telling about their personal stories and their personal journeys, and that can be deeply compelling for people. And so what I really looked at is the way that just like a beauty influencer or a celebrity singer or any number of other online celebrities are able to build that kind of trust and intimacy with their audiences and then sell them on some sort of product or their new album or whatever release is coming out. Far-right influencers are able to do the same thing, but essentially sell them on far-right politics. And so to your point in your question about how intentional it is, I think it varies from person to person. So a lot of people now will refer to far-right grifters to refer to this type of person who I think people assume doesn't actually believe what they're saying, but they've identified that it can be incredibly lucrative and can get them a lot of attention and fame if they start feeding into some of these conspiracy theories and ideas. Some of them, however, do seem to be kind of genuine evangelists for the ideas that they're espousing. And there's maybe kind of a third in-between space where people may start making content that dabbles in far-right content and may see that it kind of brings them a lot of success and attention, and they may kind of subconsciously be incentivized to keep making further and further right content. So you actually see creators that are kind of getting radicalized themselves over time, and it's unclear exactly what those forces are. So to me, I think there are all of these potential incentives. I think it's almost impossible to tell in any individual case what particular recipe of those different incentives is at work. And in fact, I think that's part of the problem, is that social media platforms have created this environment where true belief becomes kind of completely interlinked with what will build you an audience.
Yeah, it's like the most dysfunctional casino possible, and there's just people running all over the floor trying to figure out how they're going to pull up a full house on their hand. That was a really belabored analogy. Anyway, Hussein, as you were talking to people for your book and conducting these interviews, I'm curious if you would have any takeaways on sort of maybe not on the creator level, but on the individual or the consumer viewer, we call them a viewer level, kind of how this interaction with this content works in practice. And is there any like really clear way that somebody on the outside, whether it's a family member, a colleague, etc., can kind of recognize that this is happening? I'm curious what that sort of evolution looks like, because as we mentioned before, it's it's almost never the case that you click the naughty YouTube video and then all of a sudden all your ideas change. This is a process.
It's really difficult because, again, like, so one of the elements of my book that I found very interesting was when like the Muslim social spaces, which you'd expect to kind of be very separate from other mainstream social spaces, kind of interacted with other kind of radical groups, or like groups that we would consider to be radical. So for example, like one of the interesting subcultures that I found were like Muslim men who were really involved in like red pill communities, like manosphere type of stuff. And their thing was very much like, you know, we know that some of the red pill guys aren't like big fans of Muslims. They kind of say that, you know, that the presence of Muslims in Europe posits a threat to like white ethno-nationalism and stuff like that. But we think that they're absolutely right when it comes to feminism and the ills of feminism. So we're willing to kind of like ally with them on this particular thing, right? So then you end up having these like, you know, young Muslim men who are really, really influenced by like, you know, the red pill stuff, because all of a sudden their identity is like one of being, you know, a cisgendered heterosexual man, and therefore like suppressed by, you know, this social structure that really, you know, values and, you know, puts feminism on a pedestal and all these types of things that like they were telling me when I was interviewing them. And I think like that's one of the difficult elements, like, you know, and again, it goes back to this thing of like, we have this image of how online radicalization works. And, you know, one of the best examples, funnily enough, that this was shown was in like the Netflix, I think the Netflix the documentary called The Social Dilemma, where I think they kind of like have this fictional guy who is like slowly getting radicalized by this caricature of like Alex Jones. And the idea is that, oh, you know, if they're watching people like in this room, in like dark rooms, very dimly lit with like these types of microphones, then like your son is probably getting radicalized by a nefarious man. When in reality, it's like a lot more complicated, because I think like, you know, as different subcultures sort of merge, it's really difficult to locate like what is, you know, what's a radical opinion, or like, you know, what is kind of something that could lead to radicalization. This was the issue with like conveyor belt theory when it was like a big thing in like in the UK and like the government conversations among government ministers, which was that you couldn't really pinpoint the moment where you could say, okay, this type of content that people are watching will lead to violence. You know, and I think even to this day, it's still really tricky to like define what leads to violence and what doesn't, because, you know, for all the, you know, when we talk about January 6th, we also, again, we're talking about the people who stormed the Capitol and, you know, did express like violence and aggression, but we aren't really talking so much about the people who kind of sat at home watching on their computers. We're not really talking about people who were like commenting in like the YouTube sections, or at least like mainstream media really isn't. These people are like not violent. They might be able to kind of control themselves and be like part of mainstream society for like most of their lives, but like they still have this worldview, and that worldview is the thing that we know can like lead to violent ends. And I think that's kind of where the challenge is. And, you know, to be honest, I don't really know like what. I had a few parents contact me when the book got published to be like, I think my son is like watching this material and I'm really worried about what to do. And the only thing I've really been able to say to them is like, try to watch the content yourself and like see, you know, because really what you do is you have to like understand the way in which the internet, like the way that the internet works and like how people operate on like platforms. And I think finally, I know I'm going a bit long, but like just one thing that I was thinking about now was that it becomes even more difficult when all of us kind of exist on the same few websites, and where like these types of radicalization narratives happen in the same Twitter space as like you know, you follow your work colleagues in, or, you know, you're following like, you know, soccer scores and stuff like that. It's, you know, so it's not the case of like, oh, this forum or this website or like, you know, 4chan or 8chan, like this is the place where all this like really bad, like these bad narratives perpetuate. It's like, it happens on Twitter, it happens a lot on Facebook, it happens on Instagram, it happens on TikTok. These are all like websites that basically like own the internet at this point, right? It happens a lot on like Twitch, where, you know, Amazon Web Services is, you know, very heavily involved in that. So like that becomes really, really difficult. And I think that's kind of where, you know, that's the job of like, you know, people like us and people involved in this space who spend a lot of time trying to figuring out the social mechanics of being online to like explain that. And I think that's kind of like, so it's less to do with like regular viewers, and I think it's much more to do with how do we get more journalists to like on like more researchers to kind of really communicate these like issues with these mainstream platforms in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge challenge on an individual level. You definitely don't want to look at someone like Hussein in the room with the light and the microphone and think, oh my gosh, look at this radical streamer.
Yeah, and it could happen. It looks, the aesthetic is there. So
yeah, so Becca, real quickly before we jump on to our last question here. It can be very hard on the individual level, but as far as the substance of ideologies, particularly I'm thinking conspiracies, because especially during the pandemic over the course of last summer in the US, especially with racial justice protests going on, conspiratorial worldviews kind of boomed and blossomed and reached parts of the internet that we normally don't see them in. And, it can be hard to know, this notion of conveyor belt theory being brushed aside. It's hard to know on an individual level when somebody is turning that pike, but for the substance of the content, is there sort of a point where a conspiracy theory can, become something more concerning? I'm thinking on the spectrum of Bigfoot conspiracy theories aren't necessarily scary, right? People might believe in Bigfoot, but they don't build compounds out in the Pacific Northwest and stockpile guns to go hunt for Bigfoot, right? So I'm curious your thoughts on sort of the ideology and when that pivots.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's true. I like to joke that I love following celebrity culture, and I have my own little conspiracy theories about celebrities, right? We all kind of indulge in that thinking a little bit. But what does become concerning? There's a few things. I think there can be a level of trying to look below kind of whatever a surface level story is, while also acknowledging, okay, I'm taking part in a little bit of conspiratorial thinking here. And when you stop with that little caveat and kind of wholeheartedly buy into an idea, that starts to become a little bit more concerning, particularly because there's been a lot of research that shows once someone buys into one conspiracy theory, they're way more likely to buy into a bunch of other conspiracy theories. And so, for example, if we think about one conspiracy theory that seems ridiculous but harmless, it's the flat Earth conspiracy theory, where people think that the Earth isn't actually round and it is flat, and there's been this kind of major conspiracy covering up the truth that the world is flat. That in and of itself seems just kind of oh, that's silly, that's harmless, why do people believe that? But what's particularly troubling is that once people buy into that, and you think that it's possible for this entire conspiracy to be covering up kind of the truth of the world, then you've opened yourself up to believe in any number of other ideas. And so you have this phenomenon where so many conspiracy theories end up with conspiracy theories that are anti-Semitic or somehow racist or in other ways bigoted. And the kind of baseline anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is this idea that there's kind of a powerful secret cabal of Jewish people running the media, the government, banks behind the scenes. And that essentially, is leads one very quickly into neo-Nazi ideas. And can very easily kind of, bring people towards violence. You also have the white genocide conspiracy theory that, white people are being murdered or are, essentially going to be a dwindling population, and that's a very concerted effort by a group of powerful Jewish people. And what's concerning is how quickly it's easy to toggle from kind of a seemingly harmless conspiracy theory to one of these other ones. And it doesn't always happen. Some people stay kind of surface level, silly conspiracy theory, but it's concerning when you do have that higher likelihood that once you've bought into one, you're more likely to buy into the others.
Well, this conversation has been really great. I'm sure we could keep going for hours. Hussein, Becca, thank you so much for joining us. It definitely, from the amount of answers in this panel that were, it's kind of hard to say, or we don't really know. It certainly sounds like there is still plenty of work and plenty of mileage to go in understanding this issue. And I just want to thank you both for the excellent work that you've produced in this space and the way you've been able to further understanding. And again, thank you for joining us here at 360 OS.